Check out other series videos, which you will find in the chat. Today's dialogue is focused on equitable budgeting, and we're thrilled to be joined by folks from the Nonprofit Finance Fund to hear about how nonprofits and funders can advance equitable full-cost budgeting in support of thriving nonprofits and communities. Nonprofit Finance Fund is a national leader in helping nonprofits leverage their budgets as a strategic tool for deeper impact and in positively impacting how resources flow to nonprofits. So what exactly are these 7 actionable principles for a strong social sectors? CNE's 7 actionable principles are 7 APs, and their companion resources are designed to build capacity within and bridge understanding between nonprofits and funders to strengthen the social sector and deepen our impact in service to community. Today's event specifically highlights Principle 1, create strategic budgets, and Principle 5, develop leaders. We encourage you to learn more through the links in the chat. Speaking of the chat, I am thrilled to see all of the introductions rolling in. Please keep them coming, and we welcome your thoughts and feedback along the way as we build this virtual community. We also welcome audience questions using the chat function. This will be an interactive session today, but if questions arise, feel free to put them in the chat, and we will get to as many questions as we can today, and certainly we'll look to follow up on questions we aren't able to answer today. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that CNE's Charlottesville office is located on the ancestral home of the Monacan Indian Nation. We invite you to learn more, and you'll find a link to the Monacan Nation website and a documentary in the chat. And now I'm very excited to welcome our friends from Nonprofit Finance Fund, Aide Kuza, Eskadar Gaitahun, and Cindy Alcidonis, each of whom have deep experience supporting nonprofit organizational resilience and whose bios we are just now dropping in the chat. Aide, Eskadar, and Cindy, welcome to the 7AP virtual stage, and thank you so much for getting us started.
Thank you, Christine, Karen, and Brian, who have been a big part of our planning, and I know Denisha is on here to support it. So thank you very much. Can you all hear me? My Zoom message just came up that Zoom quit unexpectedly, so not quite sure what was.
We hear you when we see you.
Okay, all right. Christine already introduced us, so I'm going to skip our introduction slide and just go on to talk about NFF. Just want to say that we appreciate the support and partnership of bringing this workshop to Virginia nonprofits and funders. Eskadar, Cindy, and I are all work with the consulting department at NFF, and where we provide client and customized coaching and resources. Sorry, got a little nervous with the whole Zoom thing popping up, so I'll get on a roll in a minute. NFF also provides financing, conducts a national survey that includes thousands of organizations in the nonprofit sector, and you'll see a couple of slides today on that, and provides thought leadership to support community-led solutions. We're really happy to be here today. I'm going to go through our agenda now. The slides, I think we're on the wrong slide.
Okay, we can see the agenda.
Okay, something wonky is happening with my Zoom, so I'm just going to keep going and roll with it. So during this session, we'll include presentation, practical discussion, and resources and Q&A focused on how nonprofits and funders can advance equitable full-cost budgeting in support of thriving nonprofits and communities. We will discuss power dynamics and racial inequities that impact the nonprofit sector, and then move into the components of an equitable budget, including full-cost communication between nonprofit and funders. This is a lot to cover in the time that we have. So if you see us pivoting, know that that's a part of the plan based on what is brought up in the audience and how we were doing on time. To ground our time together, we have some agreements, and we'll be together for the next hour and a half, and we want to honor one another and speak from our own experiences and respect one another as peers and learning partners. This workshop is designed with the understanding that structural racism and other forms of oppression are present in our systems and day-to-day experiences. If there is a moment of misunderstanding or discomfort, we ask that you come from a place of curiosity and understanding for each other's experiences. During the breakout sessions, we encourage you to be fully present, and also ask that this be a confidential space so people can speak freely about individual experiences. It is okay to share what you've learned, but without revealing individual or organization specifically. And very important for us today is that this is a solicitation and evaluation free zone. It is a rare occasion for grantees and funders to come together to learn and share space that is not connected to funding or program outcome expectations. We are here as peers to learn from one another. Please acknowledge in the chat if you agree and offer other suggestions for shared agreements. As we begin this discussion, we want to start with defining equitable. A simple definition of equitable is that it's fair in a way that gives equal treatment to everyone. Most organizations do not operate using an equitable budgeting process. It's usually a top-down decision-making process with the board having the ultimate authority to approve and/or ask for justification or modifications. Because of this, there's not an easy step-by-step guide on how to get there. Every organization will have nuances and cultures that need to be worked through. For most organizations, when using the term equitable, they are referring to an inclusive budgeting process. For the sake of this workshop, we'll talk about the components of a combined definition of an equitable/inclusive budgeting process. Some of the dynamics that exist that create barriers to creating the true equity in an organization and equitable budgeting, and some approaches and tools that can support the process. Developing equitable systems and an equitable budget and process is more complicated than it should be, but the norms of capitalism, colonialist values, and hierarchy make it such. For an equitable/inclusive budgeting process, one of the most important factors is ongoing inclusive communication. People need to first understand what is guiding decision-making, especially when there is not a lot of room for negotiation. A restricted grant or specific program designs that involve multiple partners may be examples of limited flexibility in the budget. Understanding the why when limitations are present is critical to keeping open lines of communications throughout the process. We don't want people to shut down or feel unheard when we are seeking maximum input. A generous timeline allows for multiple touch points for ongoing updates and feedback loops, as well as time to review financial data will help to make the end budget more accurate by connecting it to the implementation of the work. With that, it is important to note that if you have a strategic plan, the budget should connect to it. The finances become a story that connects the mission and the budgets. Cindy is going to take us through our next session on power dynamics and racial equity.
So much, Ide. So as we begin and continue our conversation regarding inclusive and equitable budgeting, we want to be a little bit, we want to recognize that we all hope and wish that we lived in a world where we don't need to have a conversation related to power dynamics and how that shapes the experiences within and between our organizations. Unfortunately, we have not arrived at that point yet, but we'll continue working on it. But in the meantime, because we haven't arrived there, it's really important when we're engaging in dialogue about things such as money, such as money and budgeting, and specifically doing it in an inclusive and equitable fashion, that we acknowledge that not everyone is equally positioned to influence or shape the financial decision-making within our organization or outside of the organizations themselves. But we suggest that in budgeting, similar to any other kind of collaborative process that we might undergo, that time, space, attention is paid to having an explicit and overt conversation about power and privilege and how that's already in the room, regardless of whether or not we talk about it. And so we invite you to actually talk about it. And we're gonna offer a couple of ways that you might think about doing that. Next slide, please. So once we've made the decision to embark on an equitable budget process, one of the first steps we want to do is to have a shared and collective understanding of the parameters around the decision-making, as well as a strategy and a structure for the process. This will require working through layers of power dynamics, as I mentioned previously, as well as different types of inequities and inequalities that are already baked into our systems and the ways that we operate, especially if your organization is thinking about moving from a more top-down decision-making orientation to one that's a bit more inclusive of more people at the table. Some of the questions you might want to ask as you embark on this process is, who has the most power around the table? Is it the board? Is it the executive suite, the finance team, the program staff? Is it some other stakeholder that is unnamed but holds a great deal of power within our organization and our decision-making? Another set of questions to consider is, when different groups of people, some of those different stakeholder groups, when they meet on their own, who has the most power or has the most influence over the types of decisions and the ways that the conversations develop? And once decisions or conversations are happening in those groups, how do those translate back to the whatever group or table where the decisions are being made? All of that is important to consider who's included and how we include it, but that's within the overarching framework of what is the goal of undergoing an equitable or inclusive budgeting process. Is the goal of embarking on this process to diversify the perspectives and voices at the table in order to create a more inclusive process, or is it to examine the overall structure and policies and practices we use related to budgeting? Clarifying the goal will be helpful for clarity for everyone, so we're all on the same page, but it also sets the process up to achieve success. The budget, as with any activity that occurs within an organization, has significant impact on the culture and norms that get set up. So building an equitable budgeting process has the ability to move the organization towards trust and hopefully nurtures a more collaborative and collective organizational culture. Next slide, please. We'd be remiss, of course, in our conversation about power dynamics, inequities, and inequalities if we didn't spend a little bit of time making clear or surfacing the ways that racial inequity is embedded within the nonprofit sector. Who has control over wealth in our country has been and continues to be shaped by white supremacy. Wealth in this country has been built on a legacy of colonization, enslavement, stolen indigenous land, worker exploitation, policing, environmental degradation, and tax avoidance, to just name a few. And so community-based or nonprofits often take on the task of addressing issues that stem from that long history of racism. Those organizations are often, but not always, led by Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color. And you'll note that I'll use the term BIPOC in the next couple of slides as sort of an umbrella term, but please know that there's a great deal of varying levels of power and access, even within that umbrella term of BIPOC. So when we're talking about BIPOC leaders that specifically serve Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, and their white-led and white-serving organizational peers, it's important to note that that structurally they're not operating on an even playing field. We know that leaders of color at community-centered nonprofits understand their communities and their aspirations. They know the challenges within the communities, and they often have the clearest insight about how to drive change. Yet, there's a vast body of research, and some of which we'll share with you in just a few slides, that tells us that our current funding system is failing them. We're going to share a few examples from the 2022 State of the Nonprofit Sector Survey that was conducted by NFF. Just as way of brief background about the survey, it collected insights from almost 1,200 nonprofit leaders from a range of different demographic backgrounds and sector focus areas from across the nation about the impact of the past 2 years on organizations in order for us to better understand this unique moment in the sector's history. So an important finding from that survey that we want to sort of lift up is the longstanding and documenting funding inequities have persisted, specifically when we're comparing BIPOC-led and white-led organizations. The survey asks nonprofits to tell us or to share with us if they received funding in FY 2021 from each of 9 different potential sources of revenue, ranging from individual donors to investment income. According to the data that you see here on the screen, white-led organizations were more likely than BIPOC-led organizations to have received funding from all 9 of the revenue sources. In some cases, the differences were relatively small, but in other cases, the differences were fairly large. For example, white-led organizations were twice as likely as BIPOC-led organizations to have received revenues from sales and investment income, and 14 percentage points more likely to have received funds from the federal government. So I'll share one more data point. Next slide, please. And that's related to unrestricted funding provided by foundations and other donors. Overall, 36% of the survey respondents said that more than half of their funding in FY 2021 was unrestricted, which is overall good news. We like to see more unrestricted funds moving to organizations. However, there is an important racial gap in the data that we need to highlight, namely that just 26% of BIPOC-led nonprofits said that half or more of their funding was unrestricted, compared to 41% of white-led nonprofits. This finding held up even when we controlled for other factors such as organization size, the location of the organization, whether it was urban or rural, the focus area, and whether the organization focuses mostly on serving the needs of people with lower incomes. This matters because, as you know, unrestricted dollars can be used for any purpose or program. Unrestricted dollars often serve the basis for creating reserves, that is, the savings that organizations can use to mitigate risk and pursue new approaches to budgeting, for example, such as full cost budgeting, which is a topic we'll cover a little bit later on in the presentation. And so all in all, these sets of slides tell us that there are deep inequities that continue to persist within our organizations and within the nonprofit sector, and that there is a connection to racial inequality in particular. I'm going to turn it back over to Haide, who will share a bit more about the specific experiences of smaller budget nonprofits.
Thank you, Cindy. In our survey, we also asked nonprofits what is important for funders to know. And as we have a shared space here, it's what we're talking about for funders. It's also important for nonprofits to know about each other. Responses included the importance of addressing eligibility requirements to be more inclusive as small nonprofits, as we heard from Cindy, especially vital for Black-led and serving nonprofits. Excuse me. Especially for Black-led and serving nonprofits, is coming up against systemic barriers that prevent access to funding. There was also hope that the growing conversations about nonprofits' needs will remain at the forefront of philanthropy, as we know a lot of changes have taken place over the last few years. There was also growing conversation, smaller nonprofits, especially those with budgets under $500,000 or even under $1 million, face additional barriers when creating their budget. The most prominent question is usually, how do we do what our community needs when we can't afford to pay staff or provide living wages because grants are restricted and do not cover the full cost of running our programs and operations. On the next slide, we talk about we can see the range of activities that happen based on budget size. So budget size, staff functions, and funding streams, the complexity of the organization and their role in the community, and even where they are in their life cycle can impact what resources a nonprofit has to provide financial information. Beginning organizations are learning the ropes. An organization that has existed for 20 years but relies on volunteers and passion, but is very under-resourced, may struggle with following basic compliance, while other organizations are resourced to provide more complex reports and create a process for planning and flexibility. Full cost is not about where an organization is now financially, but where it needs to be. But when developing funding relationships or applying for grants, past and current financials and audits are some of the most consistent data points used to get to know an organization. Talking about finances can be intimidating, especially when the reports required are not always something that an organization can easily create. And sometimes it is awkward for funders to talk about finances and budgets without it coming from a place of compliance or performance-based. And frankly, we all have different experiences with finances, different knowledge, different backgrounds with our family upbringing and references in our life. For some, it comes easy, and for others, talking about money is difficult and something to be avoided. When trying to support moving an organization through the RFP process, sometimes funders, When trying to support an organization through the RFP process, sometimes funders have a difficult time collecting what is needed when they present the application to their board. And those power dynamics are often similar to ones that nonprofits experience with their board. So on this slide, we can see how an organization with less resources may be operating compared to one with larger, higher budget size organizations. Hopefully, it helps illuminate that it may take longer to hear back from a smaller organization because they may have a part-time or pro bono bookkeeper that only comes in quarterly, and reconciling accounts takes over a month. Or staff are wearing multiple hats and are more involved in day-to-day operations and programs. So they have very limited time for preparing reports. One of the solutions to reduce the burden of financial reporting has been to review 990s. So this can be a tool to illuminate what might be needed and is a starting point to engage in conversation and not a reason to exclude. It's important to note that many publicly posted 990s are a year or two in the past, and that they are only a piece of the story and do not include the nuances of the community impact that you can discuss when meeting as funder and nonprofit. This next section we'll discuss what we need to create an equitable budgeting process, the topic of our training or our workshop. And it won't be the same for every organization, and it may not look the same for an organization year to year. I also want to note, after this section, we'll have time for a little pause for questions. So just if people have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, but wanted to note that for you because we've covered a lot. So the components on this slide are just some of the things that are included in an equitable budget process. Most of these components exist in an organization, but generally speaking, they live with only a small group of people, usually the executive suite and board. And sometimes in smaller organization, that could be one person when I say the executive suite, and then of course the board. So equitable budgeting is about expanding that to a circle of inclusiveness, as we discussed earlier. In the next few slides, we'll discuss how we solve for and practice equity in the implementation of an equitable budget process. But here I'll just go over the high level. We can go back to that slide. So the first thing is really to think about timeline, laying out a generous timeline that gives people plenty of space to ask questions and unpack issues along the way is really important, and not always how we operate, especially a nonprofit. And in the funding world, even there's deadlines, there's lots of processes and compliance that we all are following. But it is one of the critical things to look at. And you'll see as we spend more time discussing that in a minute. For some organizations, an equity audit may be appropriate to determine if salaries and positions are structured in a way that is fair and reasonable. There may also be a need for discussions and learnings to unpack cultural elements that may not be aligned with the equitable budgeting, with equitable practices in general and goals. Sometimes that has to do with how power is distributed. It could just be some norms and how things are thought of, relationship with the community. It really depends organization and to organization. It's important to be inclusive and collective of staff and the community, staff at every level of the organization, as well as community members and other stakeholders who are impacted by budget priorities. Creating opportunities for staff and community members to name organizational needs is critical to this process, and also to collectively be able to prioritize those needs, because some of them may not be in alignment with each other. Bringing different parts of the organization together to share knowledge and decision-making power while clarifying who is the ultimate decision maker is very important. So is the board going to vote on this? Does the executive director have the final decision making? Just really important to name that. Training. Offer trainings, informational sessions so that people can participate with an informed lens about what a budget is and what's involved in creating one. Nonprofit budgets are not intuitive to everybody, and having the opportunity to review them and help people see how the budget connects to the mission is really critical, but also just showing line by line what each number means and how it impacts how the organization operates. Make financial data readily accessible to staff and others involved in the budgeting process. Build in full costs that allow for the budgeting process to intersect with strategic planning and goal setting, including paying fair wages and offering robust benefits. Meeting the needs of the community, including generous budgets for travel stipends and language justice resources are some examples. This may seem not possible for smaller organizations, but it's a way to start thinking about things. Also build in a review and feedback opportunities throughout the year that will allow for any adjustments needed. And this, we're going to talk about this in a minute too, but this may be if more funding comes in or less funding comes in than expected. If there's anything missing, would love to hear your thoughts in the chat as we go to the next slide to discuss activities within a timeline. When we talk about a generous timeline, we're saying that equitable and inclusive budgeting practice are a year-round process. This slide goes into detail about ways you can think about that process. So really the first step in a continuous process is establishing and reiterating the mission and strategy of the organization, making sure that everybody is on the same page and clear about the goals and the direction of the organization. Build knowledge through trainings, as I said before, training, and review of past financials. Take time to think about and discuss how the budget connects to the goals and the strategy of the organization. Gather historical and new data. Once the team is equipped with training and understanding the strategy and structure, the next step is to review last year's budget, as well as the organization's strategic priorities. Most organizations are use incremental budgeting, which means that they use last year's budget or actual financials as a stepping stone to prepare for the next year's budget. Some organizations start from scratch each year. Not something I've personally operated under, but I know that that is something that some organizations have implemented. So when you're using last year's figures, they're adjusted based on understanding or planning for how the next year is going to be different. Are there new funding sources anticipated? Was there a loss in major funding? Is there a new program that's going to be coming into play? So all of those things are really important. Also, if there's multi-year funding, how that plays into the budget. So the next step is drafting the first iteration of the budget by building out program revenue and project expenses. This often happens in tandem. The budget should consider both earned, like fee for service, income, and also contributed revenue, like grants and donations. You're also going to have to look at restricted funding and unrestricted funding and how that plays out. Consider what is needed for capacity building and supporting the organization as a whole. So that includes fund development, finance, HR, etc. In projecting expenses you're looking at all expenses that are required for the organization to operate. So sometimes we'll say, you have your main expenses and then there's these other things, admin expenses. There are different ways of talking about it, but really and truly all expenses are contributing to the mission of the organization. Then we move to creating a draft budget and sometimes multiple budgets with different scenarios. So approval of the budget is not the final step, but it is a critical one. As the board has fiduciary responsibility for the organization, it must review and approve the budget each year. The board may approve a deficit budget or possibly one with a large surplus. And this should include a full discussion with all of the stakeholders about the reasons for that decision or that recommendation and the implications beforehand so they can easily be explained to funders and to everyone involved in the budget process. It's important for funders too to hear from an organization and to know that they understand their finance. So that's why that part of the discussion is so critical. So the final two steps, which are not all really steps because it's an ongoing process, but is monitoring the budget. So after it's approved, you go into your new fiscal year, it needs to be monitored throughout the year. So some organizations do that year to date with the budget versus actuals. Others have a monthly budget, either split up, dividing it by 12 for throughout the year, or more specifically, they may say, okay, we expect this amount of revenue in March, so we're going to show that in March, and that increases our expenses from March through May because of a special event, and they'll show that difference as opposed to dividing it equally throughout the year. But it's essential for helping an organization determine whether it is following the plan laid out in the budget, and if not, what is different. This information can help organizations make necessary adjustments in real time and actually prepare for conversations with funders ahead of time. So if something is going differently than expected, it allows an organization to be proactive in reaching out to funders. Reforecasting is also really important when there's major changes. So especially if they're unexpected during the year, if a large source of unrestricted revenue, like folks who received the McKinsey grant funding, that may be something that's going to require some reforecasting in the budget. Also, if there's a loss of funding that's unexpected, really important at that point to reforecast. Sometimes these budgets are approved by the board and go through a process. Sometimes they're done in a scenario format. That's really up to the organization and how they operate. So the next slide just goes through a really high level summary of what I just discussed. And the process is going to vary from organization to organization. These are just common steps that are essential. So when working with organizations that are developing or changing their budgeting process, we may recommend following the general steps listed here, but there's going to be variance, as I just said. So we have covered a lot. You heard from Cindy and I, and soon we'll hear from Escadar. But we really want to just pause now, look in the chat to see if anything has come up for anybody, and take time to answer any questions.
We haven't had any questions in the chat, but welcome you all to drop any now or to come off mute. We'd love to hear your voices, reflections, or questions on any of the content.
Hi, Day, this is Christine. And it seems to me what you're sharing is kind of a two-part process around equitable budgeting. One is how can you be more equitable and inclusive in the process itself? And the second is, how do you think more inclusively about full costs and what you're actually including in the budget? And if you have both of those together, the process and the actual budget itself, then you're practicing equitable budgeting. Does that sound great
Yes,
to you?
yes, as kind of a really high level like summary of it, that's great. Yeah, Christine, those are the elements. And we're going to spend some time talking about full costs and what that really means to help folks with that. Thank you.
And so while we're waiting for perhaps a few other questions to come in, I'm curious if you're thinking about the equitable budgeting, the process part of this. It sounds like you recommended getting more of your staff and perhaps community members who are impacted by the budget engaged early in the process, and also doing some training or some helping staff members and perhaps community members understand budget concepts so that everybody can equitably participate. Would those be the two specific examples, and do you have others?
Yeah, those are critical. And I would say especially the training part, because like I was mentioning, because nonprofit budgets, aren't intuitive for a lot of people. The language that's used is not necessarily intuitive. The structure is different than what our personal, banking, online banking looks like. Really important to train people on the process, on what a budget looks like and what it means, but also specifically for the organization. How much restricted funding is coming in? Are they restricted to specific programs? There may be staff positions that there's restricted funding connected to that really impacts the structure of an organization and the end result of an organization. So the more people understand, then the more they can feel heard, but also contribute to, okay, so if this is the case, if these funds are restricted, what do we do with the unrestricted funds to make things more equitable for the organization? John, I see your comment. The way we're focused on it here, it is coming across.
Hi, Dave. Sorry to interrupt you. I'm just going to read it out loud. So.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
so
John
much.
says this seems like a very time-intensive process for small nonprofits. If you are involving direct service and other staff, how much time do you estimate per month or year for someone to participate?
That's a really good question to get specific with the amount of time. So when we're supporting organizations to go through this process and include their staff, and obviously we have our own expertise in it, so it's going to vary, but sometimes we can cover it in 1 or 2 sessions of an hour long to go over the budget and what it means, and specifically for the funding sources and how that might impact the budget. So I would estimate, depending on the level of staff, but it is probably 2 hours per month per staff person to go through different processes. Some months are going to be a little bit longer as you're really working through the strategy of the organizations, because you're doing it as a group and you want to, get as much input as possible. For some staff, it may be less because they have a good understanding of the budgeting, of the budget. Involving community members really depends on your structure. So facilitating community forums, if that's already a part of the work that you do, you can include the budget conversation as a part of that. So don't have an exact time that it might take, but those are some of the things to consider. And I don't know if Cindy and Eskadar have other things to add for that.
I think that's a good summary. I was just going to add, John, thank you for your question, that I think it also depends on the role that you're expecting from the staff person. And as Ide and Sandy walk through this like clarity of role and expectation is critical in the equity conversations, because, depending on how your team is structured, you might want managers to actively create and manage their respective departmental budgets, right? And then they would be spending a little bit more time. If your organization is very small and you're the one really doing most of the legwork, then as Ide said, it would be just a review and sort of like more of a teaching input kind of situation. So it also depends on what the specific role is of that staff member. But in my experience, at least, I have found that people appreciate the opportunity to have a little more insight into how budgets are made and created. And most of the time, people are not like tripping over themselves and eager to be responsible for a budget, but staff members are often very curious about, how a decision was made. So obviously it does take time, and I think it does reap benefits, because then there's a lot less wondering or maybe chatter outside of meetings or with staff members around how decisions are made. So it's an effective way to communicate and to gain sort of buy-in from your team also. Thank you for the really good question, John.
And depending on the staff, it could also be a kind of professional development opportunity as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, there's another, I'm going to read Jeffrey's. In my experience, most of the time a finance committee, sometimes not really connected with the mission of the organization, creates the budget. The finance committee is generally populated with finance or business professionals, and they shoehorn their budget into the process of the nonprofit. Many times, nonprofit professionals have little or no background in finance or a budgeting process. It's an observation Jeffrey shared, which I have also seen. Looks like Cindy agreed with that. Others might have experienced this. Yeah, any other reflections the group wants to share on this topic? I don't know, Jeffrey, if you had a question or if it was more of an observation.
I would just add that that's why we emphasize the generous timeline. So it's not necessarily time intensive, like every week you're talking about the budget and stuff, but just allowing people to absorb the information and to be able to come back with questions, because there isn't that much background in finance or budgeting process, but it impacts everything we do in nonprofit, right? Our activities are connected to the funding that the organization receives, or that the organization is planning on going out for. So yes, just want to agree with that, and why that generous timeline is one of our recommendations. Should we move on to full costs? Oh.
Yeah, great. So Christine said, an opportunity for a board or executive leader to train and develop staff who are closest to the work so they can actively engage in the budgeting process. Yes, thank you, Christine. So thank you all for your engagement. In the interest of time, I'm going to move us forward to the next topic, which is very exciting, which I'm excited to present to you all. Ide and Cindy have referred to our full cost framework and practice. And this is a tangible, tactical framework that both nonprofits and funders find really helpful in thinking about equity in financial management. So full cost allows us to take a holistic view of finances to understand and fund both long-term needs and long-term outcomes in organizations. So it shifts current budgeting practices, which are often shaped by the very disparity we seek to address. And we talk about full cost in 6 major categories. So we're naming and claiming all the resources it takes to run an effective organization for the long haul. We are aiming to move from surviving to thriving. So the elements that we focus on for full costs are our total expenses, our working capital needs, our reserves, our debt, our fixed assets additions, and our change capital. So there are 6 elements, and we're going to walk through each of them today. just to also mention that, as I said in the chat earlier, we have a lot of resources on our website. There's a whole page of our website, which Ade or Cindy can drop in the chat, that is dedicated to this full cost material. So obviously in the next 15 minutes or so, we'll go over it at a high level, but we really encourage and welcome you to check out those resources online. So we'll talk through some examples of each of these categories of full cost. So when we talk about total expenses, we're talking about what it takes to operate our organization. So our operating costs, our non-operating costs, and our unfunded expenses. So when we're talking about operating and non-operating costs at NFF, we're talking about operating costs being things that are ongoing, predictable costs that we all need to run our organization. So those could be, the salaries we're paying our staff, materials for our programs, and then non-operating are things that come up but aren't on a regular recurring cycle. So if you have one-off expenses that are not necessarily going to continue into the future. So working capital is what we talk about, is our sort of finance jargony term for access to cash for your day-to-day needs, right? So just like in our personal expenses, we need cash flow to pay for the things that we buy on a day-to-day basis. Our organizations need access to cash to cover our day-to-day expenses. And then we talk about reserves. This is really an important point that NFF wants to highlight when we think about equity in the nonprofit sector. There's been a myth in certain circles and spaces that nonprofits should budget to zero. And just like we know with our personal finances, that can be really detrimental because things come up that are unexpected, or there are opportunities that we want to take advantage of. So it's not always from a deficit mindset, it can be from an abundance mindset. So we really emphasize that part of nonprofits accounting for their full cost needs and funders funding parts of the full cost needs is that organizations need reserves. So they need savings and rainy day funds. So as you can see here, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but some categories of these full cost needs are, like, as we say, all organizations need. So all organizations need to be able to cover their full total expenses. All organizations need to cover cash for their day-to-day needs, and all organizations need a cushion, need savings, and need an opportunity to take advantage of opportunities should they arise. So those are the first kind of like three main components of full cost. And as we know in the sector, oftentimes organizations will have to rely on sweat equity if these costs are not accounted for. So if a leader, and this has happened in much of the work that I do with leaders, is accounting for their budget, they might say, well, my current role is ED and I'm working 1.5 FTEs, right? I work on the weekends, but that's kind of how it is right now. And so, I'll keep it that way. But we encourage leaders and finance managers and everybody involved in the budgeting process to do is really take stock of what your true needs are. So maybe that ED puts in obviously their own salary, but then also budgets for a part-time executive assistant or a full-time executive assistant or a chief of staff. This is really accounting for the full cost of operation. And then some organizations will need to account for debt principal repayment. So if they have a mortgage or a line of credit, this also would show up in their full cost budget. And then fixed asset additions are a category that focus on money to purchase a new building, new computers, or new vehicles. And then change capital. So change capital is, on the bottom of our list here because it's less common and is not required by all organizations. But when organizations are at a stage where they can consider amassing change capital, this is focused on resources they need to adapt, grow, partner, or downsize. So as I think Aide mentioned, part of the focus on equitable budgeting is really tying a budget to a strategic plan, right? So not just saying, okay, let me look at what happened in 2022 and account for maybe some inflation, and that will be my budget in 2023. We encourage organizations to think about what's your strategy, what are your dreams, what are opportunities, and money in those cases, it might require change capital to adapt, grow, or partner, or downsize as needed. So yeah, I think we covered much of what is on the example list here. And I welcome, if you have any questions as we're going through full cost, please drop them in the chat and Cindy will help me manage that. So a little bit on telling your financial story through your budget. As you can see here, there's two different examples of a budget. On the left side, we have traditional budgets. On the right side, we have an example of a full cost budget, as we just talked through the elements in the previous slide. So a traditional budget might include a surplus, but might leave funders wondering, why do you need additional funds if you're not spending down all of your resources, right? So on the left side, we see a traditional budget that has revenue of $300,000, expenses of $280,000. So we see there's a surplus of $20,000. So if we look here below the line of the surplus deficit, we have a couple more elements that are included in this organization's budget. So part of it is a contribution toward working capital. Part of it is loans for 2 vans, and part of it is for the replenishment of reserve funds. So this won't show up in the budget on the left, but they're funds that the organization needs to pay down debt and to contribute to working capital. One of the major places we see working capital becoming important, and this probably will resonate with some of you in the room, is covering costs when waiting for funding to come through. That's cost reimbursement. So cost reimbursement contracts often will have a lag in payment, and that causes a crunch on cash flow. So as you can see here, this full cost budget really takes into account the life and the breath and the reality of what it takes to run this organization. And it tells the funder who is interested in sort of the story of this organization and what their needs are, a more holistic, comprehensive story. So full cost really requires that we think long-term. And just like in our personal lives, we would quickly dismiss an advisor who recommends us to spend down every penny of our paycheck so that we don't have money in our bank account. We know that the well-being of our families, our communities require a safety net. So this is the same concept that we apply in our nonprofit sector.
We have some really good stuff in chat.
Oh, great.
We can pause after, or I can read them now if you want.
Are any of them questions?
One, and we responded, okay. But if we want to read them out loud, we can.
Great. Do you want to read them out loud, Ide?
Sure. So Jeffrey asks, would an endowment be classified as reserves? And the response is, endowments are not the same as reserves because an endowment usually has some restrictions. Example is that they're restricted to only using the interest, or they may be for a very specific program. And then how can you build reserves if funders want to see their contributions earmarked specifically for mission, not overhead? This is very common in the nonprofit world. So We really emphasize this with funders and nonprofits, getting out of that narrative of that there's a difference between program funding and admin, overhead, because they all contribute to the mission of the organization, and that compliance of being a nonprofit requires staff who are not program focused, and that means nonprofits depend on funding that covers the admin portion of the work. And also, as we've discussed, as Escadar was covering, the need for reserves for a rainy day, and for some organizations, additional funding for shifting their focus. It's just all really important of how we're structured as nonprofits. Mary Louise is asking if revenues are insufficient to fund the full cost, is the full cost budget used as an aspirational budget to inspire vision and fundraising? Yes, absolutely. It's definitely an incremental process for most organizations, unless you have like a windfall of funding that comes through. But it's just a way to talk about what is really needed. And Escadar is going to go into some common examples of how nonprofits function outside of a full cost framework that really impacts the day-to-day. That's it.
Thank you, Ide. And thank you all for your engagement. This is super helpful. I'm going to keep going in the interest of time, but if things still feel a little murky, like Erin's question about working capital, feel free to keep dropping in the chat and we'll address it. So total expenses, what they are, we talked about this, operating and non-operating, direct and indirect. So when we say direct, indirect, same as overhead, program and overhead expenses, depreciation, unfunded expenses. We'll get back to this. They're not any purchase that's capitalized or repaying debt, just because again, that comes up in another category for this framework, full cost. Unfunded expenses, they're expenses that are not currently incurred, but if covered, would allow the organization to work at its current level in a way that is reasonable and fair. So as I talked about earlier, the sweat equity concept, overworking and underpaying staff is the most common example. So the gap between current wages and fair wages for the exact same amount of work, the cost to hire 20-hour-a-week admin support that would allow the ED to reduce their time, as I gave an example earlier, from 60-hour work week to 50. Other examples are like unfilled positions. We've all, I think, been in situations, probably in organizations, where we've picked up work for unfilled positions, supplies that are subpar, slow internet. So these are not expenses that would help us to expand or do more, as we talked about change capital. They're the gaps that exist. And to be totally clear, this is not, malicious. This is not people intentionally trying to shortchange. Most of the time, this is us trying to do the best with the resources we have. But what we advocate for at NFF is for organizations to take stock of where those gaps are, so that, as somebody said in the chat, we can ask for what it is that we need from funders, and so that funders have an accurate picture of what those needs are. I know there's something activity in the chat, but I'll move forward unless Ide, there's something you want to answer. And then in summary, full cost takeaways, each organization has its own unique full cost needs. Full cost needs will change throughout an organization's lifestyle. So as I mentioned earlier in our budgeting timeline, this is part of why it's important to reforecast, to really think about budgeting connected with strategy, because things change, as we all know. And some components of full cost are needed by all organizations. That's expenses, that's working capital. Working capital is cash for cash flow needs, operating reserves. Covering overhead is essential, but it's not enough. Full costs are much more than just covering overhead. determining full cost takes time and thoughtfulness, and it's a journey, not a destination. So when we think about full cost, it's like a mindset. It's like, you put on your full cost helmet, and you're making progress on this over time. So hopefully that was helpful. Is there anything in the chat that we want to lift up?
I was just in the process of responding to a comment from Erin that says, I'd love some more examples of working capital and why it's so important. I'm starting to understand, but not quite. Oh, and then Cindy offered a response. Hi, Erin, thanks for this question. Organization with sufficient working capital can pay bills on time, even during months when there's no cash coming in. It's great definition of it. So that can happen with cost reimbursement contracts, especially where you're doing the work, but the funding's not there yet. So that working capital allows you to continue to pay staff, even through the time that you're waiting for those funds, as Cindy said. And then also, if you receive grants later in the year, we budget for a whole year working in nonprofit, but some funds may not come in till the 11th month or the 10th month of the year. So the working capital allows you to work through that. Don't think there was anything else. There was some sound issue. Somebody was
have a hand up from
Oh,
Heather
I see a
Peck.
hand up. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this gift of reimagining our operations. And one of the challenges that we have we are a less than $300,000, primarily a government contractor. And one of the things that is completely dysfunctional is that we get grants that are less than $200,000, and the overhead or the indirect expenses are in, you've already said it, they're inadequate, and there's rigidity on the government's part. And I think there's an opportunity for advocacy on the part of all of us collectively to inform the government that the smaller the grant, the greater allowance for indirect expenses. That's just that, and the larger the grant, it is possible to move toward 10% for indirect expenses. But for the small grants, it's completely unreasonable. And quite frankly, and there's also no retained earnings from government grants. So essentially, it is an extremely racist and exploitative system in which I have to function. And I don't know how to undo it. If anyone has any bright ideas, I'm very open to them.
This is definitely not going to address the systemic issues that you mentioned that come with a lot of government funding. But one thing that as an executive director I did one time with some state funding that we had was renegotiated the funding so that it could be mostly directed to staff time, so that it was consistent throughout the year and that we could make sure to at least cover personnel for our programs. Again, it doesn't address the admin costs and all that. Another thing is to consider is, are some of the people who are in traditional admin positions actually contributing to the programs? And some of the expenses that we think of as overhead, are they actually directly benefiting the programs? So I know that there's a distinction when they're indirectly, right? That whole terminology. But there are some executive directors that are spending half of their time on programs. But is that how the budget is laid out? And is that part of the negotiation with the funding? Again, what I'm saying is putting the onus on the nonprofit, which is absolutely not where it belongs, but just in the sake of working through what we're working with now. Those are just some of the things that come to mind. But Heather, you definitely speak the truth, and going to foundation funders and really explaining to them also some of the barriers with government funding to hopefully get working capital from them as a way to allow for some cushion to cover some of those other expenses might be another approach. Again, that's additional work, not an easy answer, not, you know, a magic wand, but just some examples.
Are you all doing any structural work whereby you could bring this to the attention of, you know, for example, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or, you know, the governors who are, you know, glibly exploiting low-income nonprofit contractors in a lot of different spaces, human service spaces. So there's exploitation of the people who are serving the people who need the most help.
So NFF we don't do direct sort of like advocacy / like political like lobbying type work, but we do work with a number of, you know, we work directly with nonprofit leaders and organizations, but we also work with funders on initiatives that support providing more flexible funding to nonprofits. So for example, I worked with a foundation in California that was looking to increase their general operating support. I did significantly. And so we did work with that funder to talk through like what that means for the organization tactically, theoretically, what that means for the culture of the foundation. And so we work both with nonprofits and funders around these issues and provide reports back to funders when we do hear from their grantees about where the barriers are to their financial like health and management. So there's always more work to be done, but thank you, Heather, for bringing your voice into the room. I want to pivot us to some breakout rooms just to make sure that we have enough time for you all to talk to each other. You've heard a lot from us. We appreciate all of your input in the chat. So what we're gonna do, Jeffrey says in the chat, Dan Polota has addressed this gap in his book Uncharitable. He draws this from the belief of charity from our Puritan forefathers. Thank you, Jeffrey. We're gonna do breakout rooms for, let's see, a time check, maybe 10 minutes. What are you looking for, Idays? 10 minutes, good? Okay. So we're gonna break out into rooms of 4 or 5 people in each room. Thanks to Brian in advance for being our Zoom conductor. And we've just provided a couple of prompt questions, but of course, feel free to discuss what comes top of mind for your group. So reflect as a group on equitable budgeting concepts, including full cost. How does it resonate with you? How might you put some of this into practice, and or how have you put some of this into practice within your organization? When we come back to the full room, we will ask, maybe just because we have some time constraints, we'll ask maybe 2 people to report back, and we will put the questions in the chat. Thank you, Miriam. And with that, I will allow Brian to do his magic, and we'll see you back shortly. Welcome back, everybody. Brian, is that everybody? Okay. Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you had good but brief discussions. We're down to our last 9 minutes here, so we're gonna wrap up. But before we do, wanted to invite maybe 2 voices into the Zoom room to share anything that felt relevant, important to you from your breakout room that you'd like to share here. So I'm very comfortable with silence, so I'll wait. until we get a volunteer or two.
I'll jump in. I'm wondering if anybody's got any experience, strength, and hopes around this issue where foundations are sometimes only giving 5%. And how do we inspire people to give what's needed today, which is a lot more than 5%? And yeah, any thoughts on this?
Heather, you're asking some big, important questions. I love it. I will welcome people to answer that in the chat as you're ruminating on that. If people have any thoughts or experience or articles or anything they want to share about that percentage cap. Any other thoughts or reflections from the breakout rooms?
Hi, Reddit. My name is Aaron Rowland. I currently work at Spark as the finance manager. So I had the joy of speaking with Jeffrey, Dawn, and Victoria. And one of the interesting things that came out of our conversation was kind of some of the things that are really in opposition to one another. So when we're discussing things such as, EDI, ID, and how that's kind of integrated into the budgeting process, more often than not, we kind of see the models you have this battle between the social model and the business model. So when it's coming down to that, you want to ensure that, okay, you have an organization that's going to be able to scale and that's going to have the sustainability. However, also kind of becomes a little bit difficult. So let's just say when you have like a finance committee or a board of directors who are looking at, okay, I want to be sure that the organization stays on, to keep the lights on, for lack of a better phrase. So they're looking at it from a very structural, a very linear mindset, as opposed to you may have the organization itself who's very mission driven, who has all these factors incorporated into their thought process and into their budgeting process when you're thinking about the different elements such as programming, development, all these other different elements that kind of comprise what the budget looks like. So more often than not, you kind of have this internal battle that starts to happen, to where it makes it difficult to really say, how can I incorporate these particular concepts surrounding, an equitable budget, when I kind of have big wigs, for lack of a better phrase, saying, hey, well, the only thing we're focused on is ensuring that, okay, how do you either limit the deficit or how do you begin to work towards a balance or a surplus? So it's always interesting it's interesting now to have this conversation, especially moving into the economic climate that we're in. So
yeah,
this is a very interesting conversation where it's like you kind of have like a battling out of mentalities going on.
Yeah, so competing priorities. Thank you so much, Aaron. And they just dropped in the chat another resource that might be helpful in this regard, which is around financial storytelling. And so part of what I hear you saying, Aaron, is like competing priorities around the finances, but also how do you like communicate that based on your audience and their priorities? So we'll just offer that as a resource, but obviously a really important ongoing conversation for you all to have. Okay, we're kind of down to the wire, so I'm just going to quickly share my screen again. And let me adjust. Okay. And they will tell me whether this is the right screen or not. Okay. So again, you all will receive this deck, but at the end of it, we have some pointers around conversation guides between funders and nonprofits on this really important topic of equitable budgeting. And we have a lot of different points here, but I'll just highlight one, which is an interesting one about being curious about both debt and deficits. So from the funder end, it can be a result of strategy or special circumstances, as we showed that example on the full cost budget earlier. It really tells a specific story when you have the details. And for nonprofits, as we talked about, proactively communicating how debt, deficits, and other aspects of your budget connect to the organization's mission or special circumstances. So here you'll see how to make transformative action and lasting change in this sector. We have a number things for funders to consider, nonprofits to consider. But I will highlight for funders, funding unrestricted grants generously, long-term, supporting innovation, building community with grantees, and for nonprofits to really apply this full cost budgeting practice and framework to make sure you're acquiring and aligning resources that you need. And we just want to really emphasize that when we talk about full cost budgeting, we're not suggesting that funders need to fund the whole cost of running the organization. It's not about funders being one funder funding the whole cost of an organization. It's really about nonprofits accounting for what it takes to run your amazing programs and being able to communicate that in detail to funders as they assess their support of your organization. So just want to highlight that. And with that, we have run out of time. Thank you all so much for your engagement, for your thoughtfulness. It's really been a pleasure to be in this space with you. And I will pass it over to Christine.
I want to echo that. Thank you, Ide and Eskadar and Cindy for helping us consider this concept of equitable budgeting and for your contributions to our 7 Actionable Principles community of practice. And I want to thank all the participants for learning with us, being engaged today. I know that it may feel like this is the start of a race, but CNE wants to be partners with you on this race and on this journey. So you will receive a follow-up email from us with all of the great suggestions that came out of today, as well as other suggestions that we weren't able to get to. Before we close, we hope that participants will take just a minute to complete our very quick feedback survey to help us continue to create and curate relevant content around 7 Actionable Principles. And you should see that link in the chat. And if you want to stay engaged with our 7 Actionable Principles community of practice, look out for some of our other virtual workshops in the learning series. And you can explore the 7 Actionable Principles website at the link in the chat. I wish everyone a really wonderful afternoon and look forward to continued learning with you in the future. Take care.